Welcome, good morning. My name is Lucas Evers. Welcome to this fifth day of the STARTS project and of the STARTS Prize. And we welcome you both on behalf of the European Commission and of all the STARTS partners and the collaborating projects. It's an honor for me to moderate you through a very packed day with a lot of presentations. But first, I want to say a few words about the STARTS initiative, about its vision, where science, technology, combined with an artistic viewpoint, open valuable perspectives for research and business via a holistic and human-centered, but also eco-centered approach. STARTS' mission supports the collaboration between artists, scientists, and engineers, researchers, to develop creative, inclusive, and sustainable technologies, and focus on people and projects that help address social, environmental, and economic challenges within the European continent and further about. So it's an ecosystem of projects, and today we will see many of these projects presented. So the STARTS Prize, but also the Lighthouse projects about robotics, about human-centeredness in robotics, etc. It's interesting to see that the STARTS project was initiated a little earlier than the new European Bauhaus, but also during the opening of the ARS Electronica Festival yesterday. You may have heard there is a lot of conversation going on about schools and universities as such. I think there's an interesting relation between the schooling aspect of the new European Bauhaus and that of the STARTS project, where they can be seen as both schools, where the new European Bauhaus may be much more oriented at solutions, where STARTS is more oriented at the experimentation between a large variety of creative participants, artists, designers, but also other sorts of research. So the day is a packed program with lectures, talks, panels from the Lighthouse projects like Reframe, Mindspaces, Media Futures, a workshop with a number of successful collaboration frameworks, Better Factory, Voyext, which will have a theme about the way robots can be seen as people too. This morning session is dedicated to artists working with data. We will start with a conversation that I'm very honored to have with the two individuals that form Territorial agency on oceans and transformation, one of the STARTS Prize winners. And thereafter there's a larger panel where their project is also introduced into a larger group of sword-like projects, which is a panel that will be moderated by Elena Simbler. Let's have a look. The midday afternoon interventions are about robots are people too. I already mentioned that. The art and technology architecture panel by Mindspaces and the online STARTS Prize 21 exhibition tours with who we have here in the space, Carla Sputellini and Christina Maurer. These are activities that are not so much part of this webcast, but they are happening on site. Let me have a look. The afternoon sessions will also be discussions or conversations I will have with the other winning STARTS Prize project, Remix El Barrio, a conversation with Marion Real and Anastasia Pistu Fidu of IAC in Barcelona. And thereafter we have another more detailed panel that I will also moderate, the Fabrication Deep Dive, which is also looking at that same project, but also combined with a keynote speech by Michaela Magas of the Commons industry, the Industry Commons initiative. I will get into that later. There's also a lot of other things that will happen off-site, and let me look at this. There's a panel about the intersection between art and industry in the frame of the Better Factory program, moderated and hosted by Rodolfo Groenewoud van Vliet and Ali Mohammed of this project. And if you are on site, you can still look whether you can use your swap card to join that panel. Also, one more panel in the afternoon is Made in Your City, a new value chain for fashion curated by the Reframe project, which is moderated by Christiane Beer. So, in order not to talk too much, because I'm not the interesting part of this day, that is the project that we are bringing to the stage here. I would like to go to the first conversation I have with Territorial Agency, one of the two this year's STARTS Prize winners, which is represented by John Palmesino and Ann-Sofi Rönnskog, who both work from London, but currently are in Helsinki. And it's a great honor to talk to them, because I think it's a fantastic winning project. So we will dive into their project, Oceans in Transformation, which is a large-scale artistic project that addresses the challenges linked to multi-scalar, multi-temporal, and dynamic environmental data, and investigates the impact of human activities on our oceans through data visualizations, exhibitions, workshops, and capacity building programs. Now, briefly, something about the two makers, the two initiators of Territorial Agency. They are a London-based independent organization that combines contemporary architecture, science, art, advocacy, and action based on comprehensive spatial analysis and the formation of new settings for public diplomacy. And that's a very interesting thing there, this public diplomacy. Recent projects include Oceans in Transformation, commissioned by the Thyssen-Bornemisza Academy 21. I don't know whether I really explain or pronounce that name right. You can find it on site. I think TBA 21 in itself is a very interesting initiative. In collaboration with ZKM, Critical Zones, and the Taipei Biennial of 2020. Museum of Oil with Greenpeace is another project of them, and there's many more. I think they are here. I think it is interesting to have an audience here, but there is also an audience online. And I would love to encourage the audience online to also ask questions, because I can get them here. What I want to do with the two artists is actually ask a number of opening questions, which are about their making process, because I think it's very interesting the way they bring a lot of different types of data sets together, and I'm interested in that. But I also want to encourage all of you here, but also the people online, to come up with questions about the work itself, what you're interested in, and the making process of it. So welcome. It's a little bit strange for me, because I'm looking at a screen there, and I know then I'm looking you into the eyes, but I can also see you from the side. Let me first once more say how great I think this project is. It reminded me of a book of Isabel Stengers, In Catastrophic Times, where she's also looking at this global scale of human influence on the globe, on Gaia, as she knows it, as she calls it. But it also reminded me of a book by Stanislav Lem that was made into a film by Andrei Tarkovsky, Solaris, where it's also about an ocean that is a mirror of our soul. I want to go into that later. What I first want to ask you is, how did you start to be interested in this type of data, and how did you go about bringing all those data sets together that forms all these images that gives us new perspectives on the oceans and humanity's influence on them?
Thank you, Professor. First of all, it's an honor to be part of the S+T+ARTS initiative and the Oceans and Transformation that has been acknowledged. And it's really important for the entire team of collaborators, for, of course, Territorial Agency and our Commissioner, TBA21 Academy. The beginning of the work really goes back many years when we were working as architects in understanding the dimensions of what we used to call the city. We used to have in architecture this idea that we would dominate the human environment by construction and organization of flows and both material and information and social relations by constructing a fixed framework. That image of the city, of what even of citizenship, is completely outdated. It's an image maybe that relies much on the 19th century notion of a compact built environment surrounded by what we used to call nature. Today the city is much more expanded. It is no longer a conglomeration. It's extending across vast territories. When we were starting to understand this, we understand also that when started understanding that the conditions that we operate in rely so much on available information. And there used to be a moment when planning was in the hands of governments that had major information systems to collect information and mainly statistical information and geographical information to then act on the system. Today, that dimension is so vast that the magnitude of it is comparable to other components of the Earth. So when we started thinking together with Francesca Fontis and Marcus Ryman of TBA21 about a project on the oceans, the question was for us, how do we start even getting hold of the information? What are the institutions that hold information about the ocean? Now, usually we all have atlases with a blue splotch of color where the seas are, and if we are lucky we have some bathymetry in it. So we wanted to understand who owns the information, and the research that spanned many years was mainly dominated by what we call stock taking. Who is in possession of the information of the ocean? And what came about was with an image that is fractured. It's multiplicity. There's a multiplicity. We all know that there's one global ocean, that the oceans are all connected and there's one global circulation. But what we started seeing is that even though we know so little about the oceans, what we know is so fragmented. And so there is organizations that are local, national, sometimes even the international organizations have limited availability of information, but that information is so sectorial, it's so partial, and so difficult to get hold of. And basically you need a PhD in every single sector in order to start understanding what is happening. So we made a very simple decision, and we started thinking that what we needed to produce was an image, a spatial image that would drive a focus of the different knowledges that are now trying to have a glimpse of the beauty and the complexity of the ocean. So we started, made a decision that early on that we needed to deal with data that was available globally. Not local, but global data. And that limited the spaces we operate in. Oh. Sorry, we went with the screen offline. Can you hear us?
Yeah, we can still hear you very well. Could you tell us something about the different types of data that you are currently working with, and also something about the difficulties or sometimes ease with which you can get access to those types of data? Are you still
this
there?
This is a very interesting question. It is mainly data that is scientifically originating data. That means data that comes from researches in climate change, in the circulation of the oceans, of marine life, of biology. But of course, a lot of the elements that we are dealing with tend to be images that are, or data that is also connected to extraction practices, practices that are linked to the conditions of exploitation of the oceans. And this is really the difficulty in dealing with ocean data, that is, those who produce the data are so close to those who exploit the ocean. So when we deal with satellite data or airborne data at the level of the waves with buoys, or underwater data with sonar, or soundings of the bottom of the sea and the entire water column, we deal with so many institutions that are there trying to know more about the ocean, some of them for good purposes, but mainly driven by possibility of getting more out of the ocean. So this is what we started doing, is really getting data from all the scientific programs that have satellites, basically, and then all the scientific programs that have buoys, all the scientific programs that have put online and shared bathymetric data, environmental data. And each one of the images that we produce is sourced by more than hundreds of research centers, and it's really been, say, a real puzzle to start putting together all of this.
Again, I want to encourage anyone in the audience, if you have questions, please, we have Carla here in the audience who can guide you asking them. I have another question about this idea of public advocacy in relation to the types of data you are trying to get. You are also trying to address this notion of the ocean being a matter of care, something that needs to be put into the public because there is something at stake there. There's biodiversity decline, there's pollution, there is territorial conflict. What is your strategy there, and would you also include an approach of, let's say, citizen observation of the oceans more than it is now?
There was one very first thing that we noticed when we started collecting the ocean data, and that was coming from architecture. We were very used to dealing with data that was fixed to a location and land-based. And when we came into the ocean data, this was a completely dynamic system. And we very quickly noticed that we need to deal with this data not as a division between the ocean and the land. So very much of our work was to kind of try to integrate this data and show it as such, as a very first political statement that we can no longer consider the ocean separate from the land.
The idea of public diplomacy is really got to do with that moment of uncertainty that one has when starting a discussion and a debate with others, where you understand that where you would like a condition to go, but you don't know how the others would like it. And so there has to be a moment of engaging with the other knowledges that is not prescribed, that is not scripted in advance, that there's no initial knowledge of power that tells us how to engage with it. And so the entire project is really to set up a condition that is almost horizontal, open for many participants to come in. And so what we've done in the project was not only to gather the information, but to actually show it back to the ones who have produced that information in a new format, in settings that will bring in other researchers. So you will have marine biologists discussing the law of the sea together with international lawyers, together with local fishermen, but also indigenous communities in settings that were quite messy, quite unstructured from the outset. But suddenly people started giving up their expertise hat and dealing really with the growing preoccupation about the ocean. The ocean has been modified so much by, let's put it in a straightforward way, by us extracting fossil fuels and burning them. The detritus, the debris of that fossil fuel burning is both, of course, in the carbon dioxide in the sky, but it also is absorbed in the ocean. It acidifies the oceans, it heats them up. The circulations of the ocean have been modified. The oceans are starting to swell, and the horizon is basically going up in a very frightening acceleration. And if we are all good boys and girls, and we do manage to meet the Paris Agreement of, let's say, even the 2 degrees, not the real target of 1.5 degrees, we might have enough locked-in energy in the greenhouse to make the oceans grow well beyond the 1 meter, 1.5 meters that is predicted by the end of the century, but really go to air and cover areas well beyond 4 to 6 meters that, if we are lucky and we don't even consider the melting of Greenland and Antarctica and the third pole of the Himalayas, we will cover in water areas that are now inhabited by 1 billion people. And what we just saw in New York with the aftermath of a tropical storm in the Gulf is nothing else than a glimpse of what sea level rise is doing to the ocean. So it's really difficult to understand notions of citizenship and owning data and being able to act on data when we consider that all our institutions are landlocked, are land-based. We have land-based states, we have land-based notions of citizenship, and we basically are proposing to start operating in a condition where the horizon is not just us on land looking at sea, but we start being within a complex dynamic. This is the real challenge that we are facing at the moment with thinking the ocean.
Yeah, coming back to this question of the participation of others, I would be interested. You are a team of 2. And you may know the Feral Atlas project of Anna Tsing and all the people that collaborate there, which brings together so much information. Could you imagine expanding your work, working with citizen participants that also bring you data about smaller events you may not have direct access to that deal or that significantly show climate change, like the floods we have had in Europe recently, but also the New York events, etc. Because I think if you map all those smaller events, you will also clearly get a dynamic picture of the pace with which this change is happening.
I think it's really so important that each one of us is starting to narrate and tell stories to others about how climate is changing, how they are relating to the new Earth that we discovered. You mentioned Isabel Stengers and, of course, James Lovelock's Gaia. Gaia is not that blue marble that we are all used to imagine when we talk about the ecological rise. You know, that is still an idea that you look at it from the outside. The entire discussion is to start imagining new ways of collaborating and being together within Gaia, within the only living planet that we know of, and to understand that even the multiplicity of planning and initiatives that every living entity is doing is contributing to the multiple dynamics of the ocean, of the planet. And the oceans are the most sensitive component of it. They record, they are a registering machine. They record and sense, they are sensorium of all the activities of life. And now there's one species that is starting to use much more energy than every other species on the planet. So we are now in a situation where humans are using as much energy as all of the rest of biomass. And this is modifying deeply in the entire dynamics of the Earth. And the only way that we can start thinking this is really through collaborations, through a multiplicity of collaborations, both between individuals, groups, institutions. We hear many times that this is a structural issue, but we need to take that notion seriously and start thinking, how do we collaborate in thinking what we still conceive as the body politic, as a unified condition, and think it no longer as a unified, but as a networked relation. And that, I think, where information technology and data technology is going to play a major role, but we need to have at the center of that the understanding that it needs to be transformative for citizenship. It needs to transform the very notions of what it means to have common institutions. How do we make things in common? And that is the drive. And the project has collaborated with hundreds of scientists, with hundreds of artists and local communities. And we tried really hard to understand. Of course, we have our team with the researchers and then TBA. But the question is, how do we establish a condition where other voices have equal power than the major voices that are currently debating the oceans? We still are in a situation where we know much less about the ocean than we know about Mars. And that new knowledge that we need to expand into the ocean cannot be held only by the large corporations that are exploiting the oceans. It needs to be horizontally distributed, and citizens need to be engaging with it. And we need to democratize information about the ocean. Yeah.
Again, any questions of the audience? I have a follow-up question about this democratization process. You are architects. You are based in research, in multidisciplinary research. I think your artistic attitude most probably enables you to bring so many different perspectives together that normally would be bound to disciplinary rules. You can cross those barriers, bringing that together. So there is the artistic aspect of the work. Yet at the same time, we're also discussing a lot of the political elements that are also pushing you or motivating you to do this work. Is your project a research as such, or are you also related to that idea of public diplomacy, going at governments, going at the European Commission, going at other governments worldwide to strengthen the message that something needs to be done here?
Well, territorial agency really would like to offer this idea of using remote sensing, this data, and putting them together in multiple images and overlays, which Oceans in Transformation is doing, in order to gather and see those new possibilities. I think that's really the first step for us, to gather around these images and in a new, sometimes off-putting for the audience, or difficult images to view. And that's the first step to start these discussions.
When we presented the project at the event organized and initiated by the Commission called the All Atlantic gathering, where for the first time all the countries around the Atlantic gathered together to start discussing the preoccupation about the transformation of the Atlantic. What was really apparent was that the conditions through which politics usually operates exclude images. They exclude information. It's all about distilling everything to a policy that means text-based decision-making. And this is how the modern state has operated, dominated largely by lawyers. And I think that the arts have been relegated on many levels in popular culture to decoration. On the contrary, the images that we produce, and they're not really particularly interesting images, just a lot of data put together. What they do is that they gather people around them, and they operate in a completely different aesthetic regime. And I think that is something that could be really interesting to start understanding, especially in Europe, a continent which is a series of peninsulas stretching into the oceans, that has engaged so much in painting. Europe is a culture of painting and music and singing and talking, not only writing and literature. And we need to understand better what is the power of these organizations that we have, also with the burden of knowing very well that all the mess that we are describing, and it's a gigantic mess. The disruptive times of Gaia are originating at the same time from that very same culture. And this is really the difficulty, How is Europe operating in a world where we have the burden of having unleashed all of this, and at the same time having still the capacity and the preoccupations of engaging with it in what we hope an innovative and open way. So this is really, we're at the cusp, I think, where technology can start reflecting back on the Earth system and engaging with the Earth system, not only in retrospect, looking at what we've done, but hopefully looking forward and being able to proactively act.
We have a question of from someone in the audience. Yeah. So there's a microphone coming. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So I guess the question is very simple and then probably not that simple, but I'll keep it short. How do we deal with the complexity of things out there as compared with, let's say, former reductionist thinking in science? So what role would the arts have in times when I'd say even science acknowledges that we need to open up to the actual overwhelming complexity of things? How can we analyze this? How can we make this graspable? How can we make it readable? Because a bunch of data is not really helping with understanding things. Right?
Data is nothing unless it's knowledge. I've been reading this little beautiful text by Erwin Schrödinger, What is Life? And in an astonishing way, the text opens by him saying and stating that it's obvious that a scientist is required to have first-hand knowledge and experience of the elements that they are describing. And this is at odds and puts what he calls a queer question to the contemporary formation of knowledge, because the very institutions that are there to form knowledge are called universities. And they are organized around the idea of the universal. That means a possibility of comprehensive knowledge. And it's quite obvious that you cannot have comprehensive knowledge and at the same time have first-hand knowledge. If you would engage your entire career in creating the comprehensive life, you will only deal with secondhand information. And so this is really the difficulty of the institutions that we rely on, but it's also, we think, the major possibility that the new technology offers. Because rather than thinking the university, what we need to start thinking is the multiplicity of knowledges, that each one has a first-hand information, each one has a first-hand capacity, and each is incredibly intelligent. So the question is, how do we use the intelligence of individuals, groups, institutions, and start making them talk to each other rather than integrating them? So I think art, in that sense, in particular the art space, has become one of the few spaces that allows still that discussion to happen across intelligences. It's not about really the artifact, but it's about what the art makes, what it produces, what it moves. And I think art needs to be thought again as the moment where intelligence goes from one individual to the other, where individual apprehension and comprehension of a phenomena can start discussing with a similar intelligence of the others. Otherwise, we end up, again, dreaming of universities and universalism with all the drawbacks and difficulties there.
Yeah, I hope this is a satisfying answer, but I think the actionable context within which the arts can do something is adding to your question there. We have another question from the audience, yet at the same time, we're really at the end of this session. I think our two speakers of Territorial Agency are approachable through email if it's a very pressing question. It's really unfortunate that we don't have you here to go to a bar, to have a coffee and have an after conversation. Yeah. The work of the oceans in flux of Territorial Agency can be seen here close by in one of the STARTS exhibitions. I want to thank you once more for being with us all the way from Helsinki. I think it's very interesting that we have this combination of online and on-site presentations. I hope to be speaking to you in the future. Yeah, we are going to the next panel. The next panel is again with you. So if the person in the audience will be staying, it's a longer panel where we have a number of other artistic and creative collectives presenting. So that's Geocinema, that's Tactical Tech, and again Territorial Agency. That will start at 11 and will be moderated by Mar Santamaria, who's co-founder of the 300 kilometers per second urban planning agency that explores the potentials of big data and new computing paradigms to improve urban analysis. I think she was part of the STARTS winning project in 2019. So please stay tuned or be back at 11 o'clock here in the same space where we again have the presence of Territorial Agency. For now, I thank you and we'll be back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Marcus Ryman. I'm the director of TBA 21 Academy and its home, Ocean Space. Ocean Space is a new center in Venice, catalyzing ocean literacy, research, and advocacy through the lens of art. It's a collaborative platform that brings together artists and scientists, architects and activists and researchers to together foster ocean imagination, and ocean action. And as we're in Venice, we chose for the second exhibition of Ocean Space, we chose to work with an architecture collective called Territorial Agency and present their work Oceans in Transformation, which is the culmination of a 3-year long-term research commission that started with the investigation of sea level rise. And what better place to investigate sea level rise than in Venice? So I invite you now to follow me into the exhibition and see the work.
Territorial Agency has been investigating the Anthropocene, the age of the transformation of the planet, for about past decade or more, trying to contribute to the amount of knowledge produced by various scholars about this particular age and the transformations it brings about. Oceans in Transformation is an attempt to unravel the mechanisms of transformations on the planet from an oceanic point of view, meaning looking at the Anthropocene from the oceans. So the question they are posing initially is, how can we sense, how can we make understand the transformations of the oceanic, whereas the ocean is an area that is invisible, that doesn't afford us a view into its body, if you want. So what instruments, what possibilities of knowing do we have in order to develop an image of the oceans and its transformation? One. And secondly, how can we bring together the various ways of knowing, the various sciences, investigations, data collected on the ocean, so that they form a body of knowledge and are syncretized as one coherent story of the ocean. And in order to do that, they have both developed an aesthetic representation. These are the fields of images and compositions that you see behind me, but also a conceptual repertoire that is very important for us to understand, because it is the ideas, the understanding, the ways of knowing that perhaps also lead us to a better safeguarding of the ocean.
You can go first.
The project of geocinema started from our interest in the unobvious images of the Earth, the ones that do not hold a place in the human system of representation and interpretation. When we say the image of the Earth, what do you think of? The blue sphere floating in space, likely. What if we say that this is not how the planet looks? This is one image of the Earth. A patch of land in Tingana, Australia. It is not only seen by a camera in a satellite. There are multiple sensors that translate various chemical and mechanical stimuli coming from air, light, reflectance of the ground in real time. And while processing that information, trigger specific corrective responses towards the best scenario for image acquisition. This process is called calibration. When calibrated properly, raw satellite image contain data that can be algorithmically extracted, processed, and analyzed for quantities and qualities of the Earth's crust. So the Earth is not just seen, it is not a passive backdrop that is being captured. The land, the air, the light are co-composing the image by feeding into intelligent algorithmic imaging apparatus. The land is formed by framing. One more image of the Earth. This is a mathematical modeling of the Earth and its climate. You can see on the screen how Earth observation data gathered since 1970 is being processed to simulate weather in far and distant futures. On a satellite footage, you can see that the surface of the Earth is being photographed in a fragmentary manner, and then these patches are stitched together into an image of the globe. In fact, satellites never capture holistic images of the Earth. It takes 16 days for a satellite to orbit the Earth and to cover it fully. The Earth is being constantly recorded. We just briefly mentioned aerial imaging, but there is much more to that. The planet is fully wrapped with signals which are mediated technologically, with various sensor-based technologies, personal gadgets, etc. Each have their own parameters of scale and temporality, intervals of signal transmission and transition into a visual form, if ever. There is this massive archive of data that is a constantly recorded version of the Earth. And unlike this familiar blue thing, that looks like a perfectly graspable, comprehensible object, the Earth, in fact, is an assemblage that as a form of a single image is ungraspable. Looking at this earlier photo of technicians with the stripes of the Earth footage as seen from the Corona satellite, we were quite fascinated how it resembled the editing rooms in the pre-digital filmmaking era. We stayed with this idea of cinematic montage and then asked rhetorically, what would that mean to further explore the notion of cinema on a planetary scale? The overabundance of recording, archiving, distribution of data and images is overwhelming. The speed of these processes flags up many questions in relation to how we understand time or our cognitive abilities to critically reflect on these processes and their effects. Cinema, despite it feeling like an old-fashioned word, became productive as a prism to think through and to produce work. We directly borrow from this idea of montage when we speak of representation of the Earth as never being holistic. Filmmaking has always been entangled with the new optics and recording methods being developed for the purposes of industry, science, and military. In fact, as technology, the moving image came out of scientific laboratories and was mostly used to study movements of the object, be it an animal, a machine, or those who were equated to objects, such as women, people with mental illnesses, indigenous populations, and others. Key is that a moving image is not only something that can capture time and movement, but there is this possibility of power and control inscribed in it from the very moment of its inception. There was another implicit characteristic of a moving image, which is psychological or neurological effects on one's own perception. Cinema refers to a technique of mediation of space and time in a way that is potent of feedback loops between our optical nerves and sensory experiences and moving images. It is already here that we were interested in the agency immanent to this medium. Technological recordings and reproductions of acoustic and optical data have critically changed the state of reality. Media theorist Jutta Hall refers to Kidler when she writes that cinema has the power to define what reality is. It is capable of dictating how we are able to perceive and conceptualize the world. With geocinema, we wanted to further expand the idea to even a greater scale. A century ago, Dziga Vertov experimented with fixing his camera on a train so it can be detached from the human's body and merge with the machine on the level of speed and perspective. He was thinking of it as the kino eye, an eye of a camera which is in its capacity and agency exceeds that of a human. Since technological advancements in the 21st century, introduction of personalized gadgets, more complex and ubiquitous form of computing, increasing development of surveillance systems, etc., reality has become much more complex too, as well as even more discrete. With the attention to regimes of power and control that are inscribed in the cinematic apparatus at its start, we were interested in its emancipatory potential as well. If a moving image has its agency in igniting forms of perception, we wanted to further explore the possibility of understanding cinema as a collective experience of being entranced within a shared space, even on distributed screens, especially as it moves across scales. Our collaborator, media theorist Jussi Parikka, wrote that imaging and sensor-based techniques that have proliferated over the past few decades are emblematic of alternative sense of visuality, but also the political formulation of issues of territory and futurity. This visuality is less about the images as such, but about the architectures, labor, and infrastructures through which the operations unfold. Crucial here are questions about the ontological and epistemological status of these images, what they are and what they do, and importantly, how can we intervene into these processes on the level of politics and poetics. The imaging techniques today are operationalized in ways that escape immediate visibility or perceptibility. They are part of larger constellations that include migrating forms of governance, which spread through the territorialized flows of global markets and have become further obscured by the seemingly invisible and not necessarily territorial regimes of data. This constitutes the new epistemological condition within what is now called the Anthropocene. If the image of the Earth as a single form of knowing is ungraspable, then the question is no longer what is the Earth, but rather how is the Earth? How is it being measured and calculated, datified and packaged, distributed and archived?